Ian Room to move the motion.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I beg to move that the House has considered the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme. I am pleased to have the opportunity to bring forward this debate to Westminster Hall, especially in the new year, at a time of year when many people across the country will be watching the pennies closely. As members representing rural constituencies will be aware, the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme was first announced just over 15 years ago and supports people living in some of the most remote rural communities in Britain. Under the scheme, a 5p per litre tax relief on unleaded petrol or diesel is granted to specific filling stations in a small number of rural postcode sectors. That relief must be passed on to rural motorists, helping many with their commute, their school run or their weekly shopping. The scheme benefits around 125,000 local residents across the United Kingdom and many visitors too. Remote parts... Yeah, I will give way.
Not a single part of Wales benefits from the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme, while rural areas in England and Scotland do, simply because of how the previous Conservative government designed it. Does the honourable member agree with me that this unfair anomaly should be corrected and that the scheme should be extended to places like Powys?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and I agree that more people could benefit from the scheme, and I'm sure the Minister will take note of that in his response. So the scheme benefits around, like I said, 125,000 local residents across the UK and many visitors too. Remote parts of the Scottish Islands, Cumbria, Northumberland, North Yorkshire, Isles of Scilly and on Exmoor. That includes residents in my constituency of North Devon who live in areas around Linton and Lynmouth, Paracombe and Brendan, including many living in upland areas within the boundaries of Exmoor National Park. The tax relief is targeted at highly rural areas, and a brief glance at a map shows that we are talking about some of the most isolated and indispensable filling stations across the country. Forget to fill up at Barbrook filling station in my constituency while heading out over Exmoor, and it is nearly 20 miles to the next fuel stops at Wedden Cross in Minehead, or Minehead. When the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme was first introduced under the Coalition and approval under EU state aid rules was granted in 2012, that relief was set by the government at 5p per litre. But that 5p per litre remains unchanged today in 2026, despite more than 30% of its purchasing power being eroded over that time due to inflation. An update to the scheme is now long overdue. According to research by the Rural Services Network in 2023, transport difficulties in highly rural areas force households into paying high costs for motoring, which contributes significantly to rural poverty. Put simply, you need a car for daily life, and if you earn a modest wage, that is expensive. They estimate that for every 10% decrease in public transport speed relative to motoring in any area, the average household pays over £400 more for transport each year.
Will the honourable member give way?
I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the relief scheme would be complemented by a pump watch scheme, whereby the petrol price comparison platform has rapid publication of all fuel costs for forecourt prices? This is approved by the Competition and Markets Authority, and the RAC say they estimate this might take up to 3p off a litre in addition to your specific rural relief scheme of which is spoken. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for that contribution, and I know that there are various apps out there that do this, and I think there should be more awareness of those differing apps to the members of the public. Fuel duty is only part of the expense of running a vehicle, but many of those who fill up in areas impacted by the scheme have simply no transport alternatives. In my constituency, the households that benefit are 20 miles from their nearest train station, and bus passengers receive only the most limited bus service. Those passengers are also hit by annual price increases from bus companies every January that put extra strain on the cost of living. Nor is the scheme particularly expensive. In the published list of non-structural tax reliefs, the Treasury estimates the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme costs only around £5 million per year, and its uncertainty rating is considered low. Yet during the past decade, the scheme has been a roaring success. Barbrook Filling Station in my constituency tell me that this tax relief has made a massive difference to the viability of their business, keeping open an essential local service for many rural residents, for local farmers and for tourists. 15...
Can I intervene?
Yeah, I give it. Yeah.
Thank you for allowing me to intervene. So in my constituency, I have seen the price per litre of unleaded is 160p. When I was in Northern Ireland over Christmas, there are places selling at 125p. So we have a 35% premium to the cost of living where I live. and the fuel is a very major part of it. There is a big question in my constituency whether that 5p is actually getting to the customer or whether that's being kept. And I hope the Minister will address that when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you. So 15 years ago, Barbrook, in my constituency, it was officially one of the most expensive places in England to fill up. But thanks to this scheme, it has stayed competitive on price as a small business and employs 4 people all year round in an area where employment can be highly seasonal. During the summer, Barbrook's fuel deliveries increased to several tankers per week due to the extra demand driven mainly by tourists visiting Exmoor National Park and the famous North Devon coast on holiday. I'm also told many of those visitors are rescued by Barbrook Filling Station, people who do not understand the extra challenge of driving long distances on small rural roads or do not plan for the extra fuel consumption of their journey. Many of these rural communities already suffer from very sparse public services, and fuel for transport is an important part of anyone reaching essential health care, such as their local hospital or dentist. As I know from speaking to chemotherapy patients at North Devon District Hospital, where I worked before I was elected to this House, access itself is half the battle. My Liberal Democrat colleagues and I, including the member for Orkney and Shetland, the member of Westmoreland and Longsdale and others championing the real needs of very rural areas, plus colleagues who are here today, have argued the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme's importance and for extending it to many more rural parts of the country. However, support for this scheme should really be a cross-party. By my count, there are at least 11 rural constituencies directly impacted, represented by MPs from Labour, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party. There are also many neighbouring rural constituencies with villages that rely on a filling station just over the border, supported by this tax relief. It has now become a feature of budgets under successive governments ever since 2011 that fuel duty will be frozen. That has benefited motorists right across Britain. Yet in March 2022, a further 5p cut in fuel duty was introduced and then held in place, even as the value of the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme continued falling in real terms. That means that in recent years we have gone backwards. Many of our most rural taxpayers have effectively increased their support to motorists in some of the best connected parts of the country. Motorists in urban communities not only benefit from more public transport alternatives, but often have numerous filling stations to choose from, all competing on price to the benefit of local people. In contrast, many of my constituents count themselves lucky to have a filling station in their area at all. The government has stated that economic growth across the country is its top priority for this Parliament. In parts of the country that are distant from major infrastructure projects, This kind of scheme is an important measure in supporting small businesses, farming and tourism, helping young people access opportunities and patients to access essential healthcare. And when the government has been increasingly under fire for its policies towards rural and farming communities, updating the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme would be one way of demonstrating the government's concern for those families in very rural areas and their daily lives. I will.
I sincerely thank the honourable member for bringing this debate. And that my Argyll and Butte South Lochaber constituency is 10,500 square kilometres with 23 inhabited islands. It's absolutely vast, and life is difficult for people living in rural areas, and anything that we can do to make life a bit easier should be considered. So does he agree with me that not only should this scheme be further extended to cover more people in rural areas and to stop the scourge of depopulation, but the value of the scheme, which has lost 35% since 2012, should be reinstated as soon as possible by this government?
I do agree with my honourable friend, and thank you for that input. When many people, Chair, are struggling with the cost of living, schemes like this are a concrete example of where tax relief can have an outsized impact. 5 pence per litre would be welcome anywhere, but it's particularly valuable to those of my constituents who have no choice but to drive, and in areas where gross median wages are £84 per week less than the national average. Just last week, the Prime Minister stated that the government would spend this new year proving to people that it can support them with energy costs, warm homes and the cost of living. Well, this is one example where my constituents see their fuel costs displayed digitally on a sign by the side of the road every single day. The Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme makes a material difference to many of my constituents and tens of thousands of people in rural communities across the United Kingdom. So I would close by asking the Minister, does the Treasury recognise that the time and inflation have effectively bled the funding of this scheme by around 30% since it was introduced? Will the government consider updating the value of the scheme this coming year to rectify that gap, at least in part? Just a few weeks ago, it was highlighted in the Treasury Select Committee that the Treasury lacks a suitable review process for existing tax reliefs. What more can be done to ensure that in future, small but important schemes that are a lifeline to rural areas like mine do not get left behind again? Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme, and I will call Jim Shannon.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for again inviting me to speak early. Can I, it's a real pleasure to serve on your chairship, and can I thank the honourable member for North Devon for leading today's debate on a very important issue. I think the one thing that comes to my mind right away, Madam Chair, is this: when we look at the price of petrol at the pumps, and we consider that the price per barrel has dropped significantly, the question we all ask: when does the dividend come down to those who drive in the roads of the United Kingdom? And maybe there's a question where the Minister can put directly to the firms who are responsible. It's an important issue, and it's clear there are stipulations with current legislation which in fact does not extend to other rural parts of the United Kingdom. But I'm here always to support the honourable member, who's renowned for being assiduous and for being committed on behalf of his constituents, and well done to him. Madam Chair, there is a strong case to extend the provision of the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme to some of the rural parts of Northern Ireland, where we have similar problems to the honourable member for Butte and Argyll referred to. We have a considerable number of areas which are sparsely populated in counties like Fermanagh, Armagh and Down, just like North Devon. Furthermore, residents in these areas rely heavily on private vehicles because public transport is extremely limited. I have constituents who contact me regarding rural bus services weekly. The issue is real and is felt throughout many areas in Northern Ireland. We have witnessed a significant fuel price difference historically between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, for example, sometimes as much as 15 to 25 pence per litre. It is significantly a large difference. There are times when rural Northern Ireland has significantly higher fuel duties, and families who live close to the border travel over into the Republic of Ireland to get the fuel, as it saves them so much on their money, but that means for other parts who don't have the access, rural areas, they can't do it. So I support local, Madam Chair, always have, and I live in a rural section of my constituency too. So I choose to support local businesses to get my fuel rather than go to the likes of Asda, etc., where the fuel may be cheaper, because the rural independent businesses have no choice but to charge more, given that they are less populated areas, and I believe there's a duty on those who can to support the local independence. Fuel is a huge expense and something which many families and individuals will not be able to avoid. The honourable member also made the point of the current the 5 litre rebate simply not going the stretch that it needs to, and he very clearly outlined that case, and I think again the Minister will perhaps maybe be able to listen to that. It has never increased in line with inflation since 2010, losing around 35% of its actual value. There is no doubt a review is needed, Madam Chair. The value and consideration for review must be looked at to ensure that rural drivers from across the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland can benefit. I conclude with this, Madam Chair, very conscious that there's others to speak, and I don't wish to go on too long. Lower fuel costs can achieve better access to education, healthcare and services for rural residents who should not be left behind. At a time when money is tight and so many feel the stretch, there is more to be talked about and more we can do. So again, I would urge the Minister to engage with his counterparts to protect the rural driver in Northern Ireland as well as the mainland UK. The same benefits should apply to all rural areas in this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Thank you so much.
Torkel Crichton.
Thank you, Ms Furness. An honour to serve under your chairship, and apologies for not informing you of my intention to speak, and congratulate the member for North Devon for raising this very important debate on an issue that affects lots of rural seats, including my own in Hill and Near. The 5p off per litre discount, Danny's discount, as we called it in 2012 when it was introduced, when he was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, shamelessly promoting his own constituency and other rural areas as well, was widely welcomed when it was introduced in the Scottish Islands, and it has been adjudged a success, though forgotten by many. If I'd been the Lib Dems, I would have taken out posters at every rural fuel station affected and told them they were getting 5p off every litre. Since then, duty seems to have been mostly frozen in budgets, and that means that the rural fuel duty discount has been frozen as well. And as the member for North Devon correctly pointed out, had it gone up by inflation, the discount would have gone up as well. I had the library do some research, and they estimated that in 2021 the scheme cost the Treasury only £5 million. Had it been increased by consumer price index, it would have gone up by 2 pence, £2 million to 7p a litre. And it affects now, it was extended by the Conservative Lib Dem coalition in 2015, and now affects 12 seats. I estimate, you estimate 11, the Honourable Member estimates 11, I estimate 12 seats. They would be 4 Labour, 5 Lib Dem, 2 SNP and 1 Conservative, the Conservative one being the seat of the former Prime Minister, the member for Richmond and Northern Eton, I think I can name him, it's Rishi Sunak. So there should be wide cross-party support for a review of the rural fuel duty discount at least. As my colleagues in Scotland have attested, I've checked today the cheapest fuel I could get in my main town in my constituency in Stornoway today would come in at 134 per litre. In Glasgow, it's 128. So far from being a rural fuel discount, there seems to be an urban fuel discount in Scotland, and I'm sure that's true of other parts of the UK. So I would join with colleagues from across the House in calling for a review of the scheme and perhaps some gifts in forthcoming budgets, or a signal from the Minister that such a review will be carried out. Thank you for your time.
Right, I've got Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and congratulations to the member for North Devon on securing this important debate today. Constituencies like mine of North Cornwall, which borders my honourable friends, are among the most rural in this country. My constituents rely on their cars to cover vast areas to get to work, to take their children to school, to attend vital healthcare appointments. And for this, when it comes to the cost of fuel, they quite literally pay the price. People living in rural areas like North Cornwall spend on average £800 a year more in fuel costs compared to those living in urban centres. These people make around 75% of all their journeys by car, and are around 4 times fewer people in Cornwall are able to travel to work via public transport than the rest of England. Fuel in some cases can be around 10 to 15% more expensive at the pump in Cornwall compared to other areas. Extrapolate that across a full year or several years, adding in the increased reliance that we have on our cars, and my North Cornwall constituents end up facing astronomical costs at a time when money is extremely tight. Under Liberal Democrat proposals, we double the number of areas covered by the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme to include places like Cornwall that are in dire need of respite in the face of these extremely high fuel prices. The government, in their recent buses bill, missed a clear opportunity to ensure that vital healthcare routes have statutory protection like school and education routes. Ensuring proper access to healthcare in Cornwall's hospitals and GP surgeries. I've just got off the phone, Madam Chair, to Go Bus Cornwall, who have explained to me once again that this government are not providing enough bus funding. So the logical conclusion of that is that we have to use our cars for those essential trips. I'm talking about healthcare and other essential trips. These aren't leisure trips, they're essential. My constituents have no other options. They're forced to drive for hours to access hospital appointments, GP appointments in North Devon, in Truro, in Derriford and elsewhere. Additionally, we'd also introduce an official government-funded pump watch scheme, as my honourable friend for Newton Abbott earlier mentioned. That would allow Cornwall's commuters to directly compare fuel prices of nearby petrol stations to prevent them from being ripped off, as we've heard from so many members, this variance in price all around the country and sometimes within the same region. Northern Ireland already has a similar comparison scheme in place, and as a result benefit from some of the lowest fuel prices in the country, as we heard from my honourable friend earlier. So would the Minister, in his wind-ups, please kindly confirm whether he will and his government will adopt our proposals to double the areas included in the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme and launch an official pump watch programme? Please, Minister, give these due consideration that they deserve. Thank you.
In the chair. The constituency that I represent, Coniston and Sidmouth, is predominantly rural. Residents live in villages, in small towns and in hamlets rather than urban centres. And it's classified as such by the Office for National Statistics, that is a rural or rural town constituency. But of course, the people who I represent don't need to go and consult the Office for National Statistics to know that, because they need only look at their wallet. And the Department for Transport survey found that people living in rural villages and hamlets travel around 2.5 miles for every mile travelled by a resident of an urban area. And so, put simply, rural life is more expensive and people pay more for journeys to school, to work, the shops and for essential services. And fuel costs more in rural areas. A UK government road fuel review found that rural motorists typically pay between 1 and 2 pence more per litre because there are fewer filling stations and there is less competition. The Countryside Alliance estimates that rural households spend between £700 and £800 more each year on fuel than their urban counterparts. And of course, there are alternatives in urban settings. There is public transport that is much more readily available. In many parts of Devon, public transport simply is not an option. If I take, for example, the West of England rail line in East Devon, its services were reduced by 50% for months across the autumn, and it desperately needs investment, a passing loop, to enable the services to run on time. But this sort of regular public transport is not an option in terms of trains or indeed buses. Many villages have no bus service at all. The Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme currently applies to just 21 areas across the UK, and the Liberal Democrats are proposing that fuel duty relief should be expanded to 20 new areas to support motorists in rural communities. The government's own assessment in 2013 concluded that the original scheme was successful in keeping pump prices down. For example, in North Devon, where the honourable member who's called this debate has identified. So for isolated and rural communities across the UK, it is imperative that the government acts on its own past advice and extends this scheme to tackle the systemic disadvantages faced by rural residents. Thank you.
George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under you, and I congratulate the honourable member, my friend, for North Devon for having both secured this debate and making a very strong case, which I hope the Minister is taking heed of. I go back, and I will indeed go back to some of the prehistory on this, because I've been around for so long on the issue, campaigning on it. And I do congratulate all my honourable friends for North Cornwall, for Honiton, Sidmouth, the honourable member for Strangford, for Nihil Near, for reinforcing the very strong points which my honourable friend, the member for North Devon, has advanced in his opening remarks. I was interested in the honourable member, my honourable friend, the member for Newton Abbott, intervening and making the point about pump comparison apps and sites which might be useful, because of course one of the places that was originally designated to be in receipt of the rural fuel duty relief was indeed the Isles of Scilly in my constituency, which I was campaigning for at the time. And when it was announced in March 2012, it was indeed very, very welcome. But of course, having comparison apps on the Isles of Scilly is pretty meaningless, I'm afraid, because there's only one pump and and there's no competition. And indeed, indeed, I don't think that it can be argued that the monopoly supplier is taking advantage of the monopoly, because they're very much keyed into the community and trying to really that they've indeed been running it as a public service. Because when the scheme was originally established, I asked the supplier, Ian Sibley of Sibley's, that provide the fuel for road use as well as marine use on the Isles of Scilly, how he obtained his fuel, and he basically took tanks over to the supermarket in Penzance and had them ferried back to the Isles of Scilly. So he was even buying them at retail price and then selling the fuel on. You can see that it's impossible for him to be in any way competitive. And it was and has been extremely difficult for him in those circumstances and his business to be in any way competitive, and had to really transfer the money, the fuel to local people on the islands, pretty much without taking much of a cut at all, in order to cover all of the freight costs of getting it there and providing the service itself. So you can see how difficult it is in locations like that to provide such a service. I think it's also worth just reflecting on the justification for this, because it is all about equity and fairness. I mean, I know that some people will say, well, hang on, aren't you, and indeed I am, and indeed others here present today, are campaigning to combat climate change, and isn't this a contradiction to everything that you're campaigning for, and you're saying that you want to reduce fuel costs, but we're not, because this is about equity across the country. It's about geographic equity across the country, and wanting to make sure that if we're going to address the cost of living crisis, which has been going on for many years, and to also address the geographic inequity and the way in which prices end up being charged in particularly remote and rural locations like this, that it's a question of addressing that. It's not relevant to in any way kind of compare or undermine the case by comparing it with that of the very important and vitally important campaign to combat climate change. So just in relation to the prehistory of it, just very briefly, I mean, I indeed in this chamber in back in on the 8th of January 2002 and the 15th of January 2003 brought debates to this chamber on the issue of rural and island transport, and indeed with the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland, who's still in this place, or not in this place today, in this chamber, but certainly it still holds that seat, and Alan Reid from the Scottish Islands made a very strong case for the importance of seeking equity in this regard, not only in terms of fuel duty, but also in relation to private car users, but also in relation to community bus users and community bus projects as well. So I was pleased, of course, after that campaigning that the coalition government brought in, agreed with the Liberal Democrat policy of investigating, as they put it, investigate measures to help with fuel costs in remote rural areas, starting with pilot schemes. And indeed, in October that year, announced that for Scottish Islands and the Isles of Scilly to deliver a 5p fuel duty discount at that stage. And this would, of course, require, in those days, EU approval. But in any case, any such thing, which is a kind of a parafiscal kind of support, it was a state aid issue, even post-Brexit, it still does require some consideration and regulation, of course, because it needs to meet competition rules. So obviously the case for it was made. The identification of the unfairness was acknowledged, and indeed it was brought in, as I say, in March 2012, and the pilot schemes were established then, including, as I mentioned, on the Isles of Scilly, and in October 2013 the project was, as it was promised, reviewed, and it was identified as working well. And so the government announced that it was going to expand the scheme, and indeed it did to 17 at that stage additional rural areas in May 2015. I had raised a petition to bring West Cornwall into those areas with a petition of 2,500 signatures, and presented that to Parliament in December 2013. But unfortunately, the government at that stage in August 2014 judged that it wouldn't at that stage agree to do that. So, however, that's a pity, and all I would say is that I do hope that the government will look at an extension. So. I'll just draw my remarks to a close, and just to say that on the Isles of Scilly there's still in excess of a 30 pence per litre difference between that and the mainland. It's a very difficult administrative scheme to follow through. It does create some administrative pressures on the small businesses that operate it, but I do hope that the Minister will accept the request here today to review both the amount of discount and also look again at the geography on the basis of evidence of need. Thank you.
Well done. Charlie Maynard.
Thank you, Ms Furness. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'd also like to thank my honourable friend for North Devon for bringing this very important debate, and I'd like to thank everybody who has spoken in this debate, and there's a very strong message coming through in terms of how much these rural communities need this, and how much they suffer. And I think as my honourable friend for Sidmouth mentioned, rural life is more expensive, and that's because of the friction of distance and the scale of distance, and this goes a long way to offsetting that, and that is something that has been a huge help to communities, and it's becoming less and less of a help because it hasn't gone up with inflation or anything else. And that is on top of all the additional pressures that our communities are under right now. It's really stretching household budgets and causing a lot of trouble. So that's the root cause, and therefore we really all do ask the Minister to address the question whether the government will consider uprating the scheme in line with inflation in their response to this debate. And secondly, I think if we look at the state of public transport infrastructure in this country after years of underinvestment by the last Conservative government, it's quite clear that there are many, many more areas, as so many of my colleagues have pointed out, where people have no real alternative for car use for day-to-day journeys, and this is far more widespread in the 21 areas that currently benefit from this scheme. Research published by the County Council's Network in 2024 found that the frequency of rural bus services in England had reached a historic low, with more than a quarter of rural routes having been lost in the preceding decade. In remote areas of Scotland, some of which do benefit from the fuel duty relief scheme, connectivity is having a clear negative impact on the population of remote rural areas, as my honourable friend mentioned earlier today, both in this debate and in the Chamber. NRS's population estimates by urban rural classification 2001 to 21 showed a population decrease by 1% between 2011 and 2020, compared to increases of 3.1% nationwide and 8.4% in accessible rural areas. So the population of rural small towns decreased by 3.6% over the same period. The implication is that the lack of connectivity and affordable transport is hollowing out these communities, and the reduction in real terms value of the relief scheme is playing a part in that. I think the government's bus services bill will make some positive change, and I, of course, support the aim of revitalising rural bus services, but with the best will in the world, we cannot turn this around overnight. New transport infrastructure, as I and my colleagues are trying to do in West Oxfordshire by bringing back a rail link, takes months and years to bring back, and rural drivers up and down the country are struggling with this problem now. As one step towards addressing this, the Lib Dems have called for a number of areas covered by this scheme to be doubled, adding an additional 21 areas across the UK who would benefit from the relief. And this should be supported by clear consultation and evidence base to determine the areas which could receive the new relief. Perhaps Devon, Cornwall, Cumbria, East Anglia, Yorkshire and Shropshire would be some of those areas that could potentially benefit from this relief, as well as rural Wales, more of rural Scotland, and, of course, Northern Ireland. Thank you.
It's Wild for the opposition.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Ms Furness. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for North Devon for this debate and all the contributions that we've heard. Of course, it was the Conservative-led government which introduced the fuel duty rural relief scheme in 2019, and that was in recognition that remote communities face higher pump prices due to the high costs of transporting and distributing fuel. And the scheme was then subsequently extended again in 2015 to include more areas across England and Scotland, providing a welcome 5p a litre reduction in prices to help families and businesses in those areas, particularly where they might only have one filling station that they can choose from. And it recognised that rural communities, especially isolated rural communities, face challenges that justify targeted support. And as we've heard from honourable members, it has proved effective and needed. And in the main chamber at the moment, my right honourable friend, the Shadow Environment Secretary, has been setting out the support that Conservatives have provided consistently for rural Britain. That's where many of my colleagues are speaking. And we demonstrated in government our commitment to those like my North West Norfolk constituents who live and work in the countryside. And our fuel duty record underlines this. As well as the rural duty relief, we froze fuel duty every year from 2011. In March 2022, we went further and introduced a 5p pence cut to fuel duty across the board. And this wasn't merely about tax policy. It was about recognising that for rural communities, a car or a van is not a luxury, it is a lifeline. It connects farmers to markets, it helps children get to school, people to get to work, to get to health appointments, and it keeps rural enterprises in business. And every penny that's added to the cost of fuel has a multiplied effect in areas where public transport is limited and where journeys are longer. And our support for rural communities expended far beyond fuel duty to infrastructure supporting agricultural businesses, which recognise the vital contribution to our country and the social fabric. And what a contrast to what we've seen under this government. A government that says the cost of living is its priority, yet is adding to costs for families and businesses. Inflation was at 2% when the government came in, and they nearly doubled it. The much vaunted promise of £300 off energy bills is nowhere to be seen. And in her budget, the Chancellor announced that Labour would end the 5p fuel duty cut that we introduced. That will take effect from September this year. This will see the average family paying £100 a year more. And the Road Haulage Association estimates it will add over £2,000 per year for the operating costs of an HGV. And from April next year, the government will scrap the 16-year fuel duty freeze that we introduced. Inflation-linked rises will follow. This marks the end of support offered to motorists since 2010, of saving them £120 billion thanks to the freeze. And that puts in context the modest £5 million or so cost of the rural fuel duty relief. In November, the Chancellor also announced a pay-per-mile tax on electric vehicles set to cost drivers an extra £255 a year. So it's little wonder the RAC has said that the cost of simply keeping vehicles on the road has become a significant financial challenge. And the Prime Minister has also been boasting about the £3 bus cap, a cap he has increased by 50%. So whether fuel duty or public transport, the government is making it harder and more expensive for rural communities. And they're not only being punished at the pump. In the debate, we've heard reference to the family farm tax, breaking up farms that form the backbone of our rural communities. And while the modest change that the Minister has announced is welcome as far as it goes, given the damage that the tax will do nonetheless, the Conservatives are committed to reversing it entirely. And as well as increases in fuel duty that I've referred to, business rates is also going to increase, hitting those rural pubs and businesses, with UK Hospitality estimating an average pub paying an extra £12,900 over the next 3 years. And the Minister has been sent out to defend the farm tax and said there wouldn't be changes, and then there were. At Treasury questions, I called on the Chancellor to look again at the business rates increases, and the Minister ruled that out then. We read today that there may be changes, and apparently the Business Secretary has even noticed the damage that this will do, presumably not from discussing it in a pub, given the bars that many Labour MPs are facing. So could the Minister confirm whether the government is considering making changes as the sector and many across this House have called for? The Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme reflects an approach to governing that recognises the distinct challenges and vital importance of our rural communities. We introduced this scheme, we extended it, and throughout our time in government demonstrated we understand and support those who live and work in the countryside. And given it's now more than a decade since the scheme was last expanded, and with its modest costs, I fully support a review of this relief. The Treasury often say they keep taxes under review, but this deserves having a proactive review of the measure, and I hope the Minister will commit to that in his closing remarks. By contrast, this government's tax rise after tax rise are making life harder for rural businesses and for rural people. Against a backdrop of weak growth and rising unemployment, Labour's approach sadly threatens the fabric of our rural communities, and those rural communities deserve much better. Thank you.
Minister to respond.
Madam Chair, it is a pleasure to speak under your chairship, and I am grateful to the Honourable Member for North Devon for securing this debate and speaking so passionately in support of rural communities and the people who I know he has much honour in representing in his constituency of North Devon, and I thank him for securing the debate and giving members on all sides the chance to contribute to a very important topic. This government recognises the importance of rural areas for the UK economy and will continue to consider how it can best support those who live and work rurally. Although my Barnet constituency, which is at the very north of London, lacks the beaches and the moors of my honourable friends, I would note it does contain 14 farms and does have some rural areas because of the large bit of green belt that extends into North London. I, like all ministers in government, am fully committed to ensuring that the tax system works for everyone, no matter whether they are in rural or more urban parts of the country. Fuel duty, Madam Chair, is an important source of government revenue that provides vital funding for public services and infrastructure. It raised £24.4 billion in 2024-5, and as has been mentioned, fuel duty rates have been frozen since 2011, with a further temporary 5p cut introduced in 2022. That means that fuel duty rates are now, in real terms, around 40% lower than they were in 2011. Pump prices are currently at their lowest levels since 2021, before Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine led to soaring prices and the introduction of that temporary 5p cut. That is why at the budget, the Chancellor announced that the 5p cut would first be extended until the end of August, with rates then rising gradually, returning only to March 2022 levels by March 2027. As well as this extension to the freeze, the planned increase in line with inflation for the coming financial year will also not take place. These decisions on fuel duty will save the average car driver across the country £49 in the coming financial year compared to previous plans. The government also recognises the importance of competition between retailers in the road fuels market. Members from the Liberal Democrat Party, including the member for North Cornwall and the member for Newton Abbot and others, have mentioned a pump watch scheme. Sadly, that reveals that we need to communicate even better about some of the ideas that the government is putting forward, because at the budget, the Chancellor was able to confirm that from spring 2026, UK consumers will also be able to compare prices more easily through the government's new Open Data Fuel Finder scheme, which I believe will achieve similar aims to those that the proposed Pump Watch proposal may have been seeking to do. This will help encourage competitive pricing among retailers and is expected to result in further savings for drivers of potentially up to £40 a year. However, the government is well aware that fuel costs can be higher in certain more remote areas, and the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme therefore provides a 5p per litre reduction to benefit motorists buying fuel in those areas. The areas which are included in the scheme demonstrate certain characteristics, such as pump prices much higher than the UK average, remoteness leading to high fuel transport costs from refinery to filling station, and relatively low sales, meaning that retailers cannot benefit from bulk discounts. As mentioned by many members, this scheme provides around 5 million of support per year, with around 165 fuel retailers currently registered with HMRC to claim the relief. The member for St Ives mentioned the administrative costs here, and I would be interested to hear more from him and any businesses that have ideas about how I, as Minister with responsibility for HMRC, can seek to reduce any of the administrative burdens that those 165 retailers may face. One area that's included in the scheme is the EX35 postcode in the Honourable Member's constituency, who brought the debate, part of Exmoor National Park. And I can confirm that it's not just 11 or 12 constituencies that are covered, but in fact 16. Some of the postcodes sneakily cross over some of the constituency boundaries, and it's 16 members of the House of Commons who represent constituencies that at least have some elements of their constituency covered by this relief. I'd happily give way.
The Minister raised the issue of the administrative burden, and I was referring to an occasion when the operator of the scheme was late in his submission to the HMRC, in which case he was refused the rebate, which of course he'd been taking, and in those circumstances he had to appeal. So it was simply demonstrating the rigidity and the lack of humour, if you like, within the system itself. You're talking about extremely small businesses which find that this additional administrative burden quite onerous.
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention and that contribution. I note, as I'm sure other members in the Chamber will, just how forensic his understanding is of some of the small businesses in his constituency, and that is to be very much commended. If he would like to write to me on that point, that is certainly something that I would like to raise. Of course, it's not appropriate for me as a tax minister to get involved in individual tax affairs. That said, the general point around the administration and the extent to which we're getting the balance right between ensuring that we do stick to the rules that are set out, but also having an appropriate level of flexibility going forward is something that I would happily raise with the department if he would be willing to write to me. The member for North Devon and many others have suggested that the government should increase the rural fuel duty relief in line with inflation. As I set out earlier, since the relief has been in place, it has remained at 5p, but the main fuel duty rate has also remained at the same level or has more recently fallen. I would note too that typically, and I'm aware that there are differences across the country and there may have been differentials in the increase in fuel prices in some areas, that fuel costs are broadly the same, if slightly higher, than they were in 2011, roughly around 130p for a litre compared to around 135 now. I would happily give way to that.
I refer to the Honourable Member for Kneeling in Yard when he made the point that getting this rebate was one of the few successes of the coalition government. But the reason there's no political reward for it is because at £1.60 a litre in rural Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber, it does not feel like a benefit. So if he's not going to extend or make this index linked, could you tell us what mechanism has the government put in place to check that this, albeit scant rebate, is actually reaching the consumer? Because it does not feel like it for people living in rural communities.
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention, and other members, including the Member for Strangford, have asked that question, and I was going to come to it, but I will happily come to it now. We, as a department, HMRC, do require the retailers to keep records evidencing that the 5p saving is being passed on to customers. That is something that I would be happy to look into in a bit more detail about how we do that, and maybe we can catch a word in the tea room to discuss that in more detail. But that is something that the government wants to make sure is happening, and that 5p cut, we can debate whether it should be higher, but that it is passed on in full to the consumers. And I note that members who've spoken in the debate with deep knowledge of their constituencies have often talked about how they sort of trust the small local businesses, many of whom will be running the garages and the forecourts that might be in the middle of the moors or in the more rural areas. And the member for Strangford doing what is a very honourable thing indeed and going to the more expensive garages to support the local businesses. That is a very commendable act. I must say it isn't one that I always engage in. I do like to find a good price, but I do commend him indeed for that. So I was noting that fuel duty costs are broadly, although I do admit, slightly higher than they were in 2011. But as with all taxes, and as the opposition spokesperson foreshadowed, the Chancellor does keep all taxes under review, and decisions on future fuel duty rates and rural fuel duty reliefs will be always made in the round in the context of the public finances. That said, I have noted with interest all of the points that have been made today, and I will, and again, I thank the member for calling the debate to give me a chance as the Minister with responsibility to reflect on these important issues. A number of members have also suggested that the government should increase the number of areas in scope of a rural fuel duty relief. I can sense a Liberal Democrat local election campaign coming, potentially, though I wouldn't possibly want to comment. I was going to say that I have not received, and I checked my predecessor, did not receive any formal representations to expand the coverage of the relief since the start of this Parliament. Of course, I've received some comments on that during this debate today. There are, as of now, no current plans to amend the list of eligible locations, but if members do represent constituencies that they strongly think do fall into the categories that are set out in the rules for the scheme, I would, of course, always welcome representations, and you should do feel free to write to me. I would happily give way.
I'm grateful. If you won't consider the geographical expansion of the rural fuel duty relief scheme, I wonder, with a view to the government introducing the electric vehicle excise duty in April 2028, whether the government might consider a sort of duty relief for those existing areas, but applying to electric fuel duty.
That is not something that we are actively considering. That said, the details of the EVED scheme are to be consulted on in detail. We're still a number of years from it being introduced. and there will be many fine decisions that need to be made in the coming months ahead of that being implemented, and I note his representation that he has made here today. I would happily give way one more time, though I'm sure that members would like me to make some progress too.
No, well, on the issue of the question of geographic coverage, and him saying that he hasn't received representations with regard to further areas which could be included, I would simply urge him or the government to review the scheme and to take an objective measure itself to review where else it might, on an objective measure, extend the scheme to, rather than inviting us to form an orderly queue of people pleading for our own local areas, which may not necessarily result in a system which is based on need, but on political, if you like, advantage.
I'm always glad to take interventions, and in response to that one from the honourable member, I will say that his point is noted, and I do acknowledge that request. I would say please do get in touch if you believe that an area does meet the criteria. As he notes in his his remarks, there aren't hard and fast rules here. There isn't specific criteria set out within each of the categories that are considered in the round, and the government doesn't intend to change that to have hard and fast rules. I would be concerned that that might lead to more complexity and change within the system if one area has prices that tipped slightly above or slightly below, and then we might get into a contestation of whether or not the additional cost of transporting fuel to certain places does again tip over or above the threshold. So I hope that members who do have any views on where it should be extended to would bear with the current less rigid process. I was going to say in a slightly light-hearted way that the member for Witney does suffer from something in tax policy debates, and that I know his constituency very well, having been born and brought up in West Oxfordshire, and I would say that on my commutes to and from, my travelling, but my joyful travelling to and from seeing my family in West Oxfordshire, I often fill up in his constituency, and it's cheaper quite often than in North London. But I did note that he was very magnanimous in not calling for it to be extended to West Oxfordshire, but instead to other areas, I think represented by his Liberal Democrat colleagues. There were a few more points that members made. I should, of course, mention my right honourable friend, the member for Nahalin Aner. I don't know whether I got that right. You'll have to teach me more on how to pronounce that properly. That's the first time I've said it. One of the constituencies that, of course, does benefit from this relief, and he made an important speech, and I'm glad to have other Labour representatives on this side of our debate talking really clearly about the benefits that it provides for his constituencies in some of the most rural parts of the whole country, indeed. I wanted to commend the honourable member for St Ives again for his engagement with his businesses, hearing about the garage on the Isle of Scilly and how they get the petrol to and from. And I think in the main I've covered most of the points raised. If members do have a burning desire to intervene to ask me to clarify anything, then I will, but I'm sure we want to make some progress. Let me just mention a couple of other points, Chair, and then I will conclude. The fuel duty system does support rural areas in other ways as well. Households and non-commercial premises are entitled to use red diesel for heating and electricity generation, which includes off-grid homes in remote and rural locations, which have limited alternatives. And red diesel is subject to fuel duty at just 10.18 pence per litre compared to the 52.95 for diesel used on roads. Farmers also retain the entitlement to use red diesel in machinery and vehicles used for agricultural purposes after it was withdrawn from most sectors under the previous government in 2022. A number of members have discussed public transport as well, and the need to make sure that maintains a level of affordability. And at the end of the last year, the government confirmed a long-term investment of over £3 billion in the next 3 years to support local leaders and bus operators across the country to improve bus services for millions of passengers. And this includes multi-year allocations for local authorities under the Local Authority Bus Grant, where from 26-27 we have revised the formula to include a rurality element for the first time, ensuring that the additional challenges of running bus services in rural areas are taken into account. I'm surprised we didn't hear the potholes being mentioned at all in a debate about urban transport, but I know that these are of particular concern to those in rural areas more prone to frost and the ice getting inside the tarmac and the road breaking up. But by 29-30, the government will have committed over £2 billion annually for local authorities to repair and renew and fix potholes on their roads, and that will be a doubling of funding since we took office. That will mean that we can exceed our manifesto commitment to fix an additional 1 million potholes per year by the end of this Parliament. The opposition spokesperson mentioned the electric vehicle decision that the government announced at the budget. We do remain fully committed to the electric vehicle transition, which will drive growth and help the country meet its climate change objectives. Our public charging network is growing rapidly. We have over 87,000 public charge points as of December last year. And in the year ending the 1st of October last year, the number of charging devices in rural areas increased by 26%. In addition, the government announced at Budget 2025 an immediate rollout of a package of support worth £3.6 billion to help motorists switch to cleaner and greener cars to support the automotive sector through the transition to EVs and bolstering British industry. Madam Chair, to conclude, the government is dedicated to supporting and promoting rural areas, in particular by providing support for transport costs, such as through the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme. I look forward very much to further discussions, maybe even further correspondence over the course of this Parliament as to how we can continue to do so. And I thank the Honourable Member for bringing this debate and for the contributions from members on all sides of this chamber today.
In room to wind up, please.
And I'll be very quick because I know we're with time. Can I thank the Minister for his response, and I appreciate you taking the time to engage with me and others on this issue. While we don't expect the government to commit itself ahead of a future budget, I know my constituents value the support this scheme provides to very rural areas, and it would be good to see some progress to restore the funding to its former level. Can I also thank all members for their contributions? What a debate! From the top of Scotland down to the Isles of Scilly and Land's End. Absolutely fantastic. And we've had representations from Wales, we've had representations from Northern Ireland, and obviously England. So what a great debate, an inclusive debate from across all of the United Kingdom and all of our rural constituencies. Can I also say that for my constituents, fuel is a very part of their daily lives. That's an unavoidable cost because transport is much needed because there is no public transport in any of the areas in this particular sector, the X35, that's regularly, and people can't walk to the bus stop because of the terrain and obviously the rurality. Many accusations have been thrown at this government during this past year, claiming they do not care about rural areas. And when the next fiscal event arrives later this year, updating this scheme for 2026 will be just one chance to counter those claims at very little cost in comparison to other schemes. So I hope the government will take this opportunity on behalf of the communities that are often forgotten and deliver good news at the pumps for rural people. And thank you.
Yeah. Question is that this House has considered the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Thank you very much, everybody, for a really interesting debate. Thank you. Yeah, so the sitting stands adjourned.